what problem are you trying to solve? Even with AI, and I take that problem there too, right? What problems are you trying to solve? And does the framework you're proposing actually solve them? So, right, I mean, and if a lot of it is around data privacy, let's look at the data privacy frameworks that exist today, maybe create stronger data privacy, and then like port that over into the technology you're talking about, right? Because otherwise you come up with these really, heavy-handed, blanketed regulatory regimes that create a lot of stress on small startups.
Welcome back to Susie and Friends, where we talk with legal leaders, technologists, and operators driving innovation and excellence in their companies and beyond. I'm your host, Cecilia Zaniti. Today's guest is Kaniah Konkoly-Thege. She's a brilliant legal mind and technologist who's built her career running straight into complexity. She started off at the Department of the Interior right after the Cobell case, which we'll get into, dove straight into that largest federal settlement implementation in history. Since then, she's gone into frontier tech, working in a lot of government-adjacent areas, bringing legal insight to everything from AI to quantum computing, where she is now. She's been called the liberal arts translator, dear to my heart, also a liberal arts major, and she sits at the intersection of disciplines and actually makes sense of them. I also count Kaniah as a personal friend. We actually met through a shared executive coach. In this episode, we're going to talk about her early career, her passion for hard problems, and how she's thinking about the future of legal leadership in the age of deep tech. Let's dive in. Kaniah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Cecilia. It's so good to be here. I'm so honored to be able to sit here and talk with you. This is going to be so much fun.
I literally can't wait. Daymaker. Let's go. All right. So you graduated from law school and started at the Department of the Interior just as the Cobell case was getting going. What is that case? Tell us about it.
So it is a wild case. Actually, so it started in 1996, but when I started in 2003, so let me back up. In December of 2002, the judge ordered the entire Department of the Interior to disconnect from the internet. So, and this is back in the day, right, where internet and access and emails and things like that were about where probably society is today with generative AI, right? Some people understood it. A lot of organizations were trying it out, but it really hadn't been this well-known thing where everybody kind of understood cybersecurity and other things, right? So the crux of the case is that individual Indian money account holders, okay, that's kind of the term used. So let me back up. In the US government, as Native people and tribes were moved to different reservations, the US government held assets in trust for them. So, whether it be in mining, oil and gas, and timber, all of this stuff, the government would then sell leases or sell the product coming out of these assets and then in theory, reimburse the individual Indian money account holders and tribal account holders for the money made off of these assets. So this case essentially requested an accounting of all of those assets. And what makes that a little unique is that usually when you bring a lawsuit against the US government for monetary damages, you are put into the Court of Federal Claims. And there had been a number of cases trying to force the US government to pay rightful amounts of money in the Court of Federal Claims. This particular case, because it requested an accounting, put it in the district court. And they happened to go before a judge named Royce Lamberth, who really, I think, over time felt like it was his mission to help Native people receive what he felt, and I think what a lot of folks felt they deserved, which was an accounting of these accounts. But what that meant was the US government had to do an accounting from 1887 to the present day. So you're talking millions upon millions of accounts. So over time, they kind of narrowed the field to doing a statistical accounting, but that still required the department to find millions and millions and millions of records. So these records were paper, they were sitting in boxes in field offices in the middle of nowhere, Montana, all the way to, legacy IT systems, right, that had been developed over the years. And so the judge had a lot of concerns that these records were not being maintained properly. He hired a team of experts to come in and do a penetration test within the department, which I think everybody knows today is pretty common, but back then people really didn't get what pen testing was. So it was fairly easy for these pen testers to find this data. And so after that, report came out, the judge ordered the entire department to disconnect. So in I walk. This was just a few months after. And I should mention, people didn't really know what that order meant. And so The rumor was, and folks have told me this when I started, people were ordered to come in on a Friday afternoon and literally unplug their computer from the internet because they didn't know, like they didn't have like systems architecture, right? Like you'd find today. Some offices may have had some sense of what their architecture and their network architecture looked like, but for the most part, it wasn't well known, and certainly where this data resided was not known at all. So fast forward a couple months, I walk in, and effectively, the attorneys on the case, and mind you, these are senior federal attorneys, were like, "We are touching this case with a 10-foot pole." The judge had been held, I mean, the Secretary of Interior had been held in contempt twice.
Wow.
And so I'm this baby attorney who walks in, like on my second day in the job. They're like, "Great, nice to have you. Go meet with the secretary." And I was like, "The Secretary of Interior? Okay, that sounds great." Having no idea, right, that that is really uncommon. So essentially, what they asked me to do is figure out this crazy cybersecurity stuff and help the Department of Justice present to the special master in the case a reconnection plan for each office and bureau. So I had to essentially figure out this, cybersecurity and what would be considered, an appropriate reconnection plan that included segregation of data and, mapping out network architecture and stuff like that, which I had no clue until I just
Wow.
started
Well,
figuring
you
it
think like, you take a job as an attorney at the Department of the Interior. I don't think you're expecting, and certainly not at that time, you're not expecting to be a cyber attorney. Like, what an amazing,
for
and I
sure.
think your analogy to AI is apt because it's kind of like, and this is I guess a career theme. It's like, what are you up for? Are you an attorney that's up for anything? And can you figure it out? And so, yeah, tell me, in this case, you grew up on reservations. So working in an interior must have had extra personal meaning. Did that come into your work on the case? And what did you end up doing?
Percent. It was, so I did. I was born on the Pima Reservation in Arizona and lived between Seminole in Florida, Choctaw in Mississippi, Navajo in New Mexico, and Tohono O'odham in southern Arizona. When I was 11, I moved to Tucson for a couple years and then moved to DC at 15. And so when I moved to DC, I had a very hard time because I was not around. It was kind of the first time I'd been on the East Coast. There's not a lot of Native people there. There was a lot of questions like, "We don't really look Native. We don't understand," right? And so I spent a number of years really not sharing my heritage with a lot of my high school and college friends. And so walking into Interior and reconnecting with Native people, reconnecting with people who look like me, but and had the life experience that I had was really meaningful. Now, I will say working on this case was also a challenge because as I was, working on it and learning more and more about kind of the institutional racism that had been put in place over the last few centuries that led to where the department was today, right? It was very educational, but it was also a bit of a challenge to really think about, am I contributing and helping or am I just perpetuating stuff? So, but it was, I think overall, it was really helpful for me just to reconnect with where I came from and feeling proud about being able to say, yeah, I'm an enrolled member of the Osage Nation.
Wow. And how did the early work, maybe tell us a war story from the case other than kind of walking in. So if you have any good stories from the case to share.
At one point, there was a legal opinion issued that I kid you not said Kaniah Konkoly-Thege is a lawyer. And the crux of it was whether an administrative lawyer in the administration, right, not Department of Justice, could have attorney-client privilege over communications. So there was some discussion between myself and the CIO of one of the offices. I don't remember which one. And the plaintiffs wanted to get the kind of the transcript and the information that came out of our conversations. And so the issue of whether agency counsel could actually assert attorney-client privilege was the question. And the judge ruled that they could. But the best part was I had this opinion that I kid you not, I printed it out, I highlighted my name, and I'm a lawyer. And so for the next few years, I had that. I wish I could find it today because I would still probably keep it. So that was
Oh
my
man, we're gonna find it. We're gonna put it in the show notes. But yeah, these moments of like identity, right? Of like this is literally it turned the case. I can imagine. So how, something like that, obviously the identity of being a lawyer is gonna carry through. Anything else from that early work shape how you think about, really big cases or legal challenges in general, or your
Yeah,
work today as a general counsel?
say two things. One, not being afraid to learn the really hard stuff and not being afraid to ask what you might think of as stupid questions. So, when I was taking this crash course, I basically had a couple folks from NIST and, probably NSA and other folks, right, sitting down and trying to explain to me basic principles of cybersecurity. And I was like, what's a WAN, right? Wide area network. What's a LAN? What's a local area net? What does this mean? Like, how do the wires flow? I mean, I asked crazy questions because I had no idea what I was doing. And I felt like I couldn't understand how to actually translate the legal part of what I needed to do, right? To show data segregation, to show that this information was protected without trying to like understand the framework of what it is, right? Because if the judge would just say to me, well, what about X, right? I wanted to make sure I had an answer. What if someone wanted to infiltrate the data by doing XYZ? I wanted to understand, is that possible? And so I just asked a ton of questions. And what I found was everybody was really, really happy to answer them. And things I thought were stupid questions really weren't. And that actually plays into what I do today. I'd say the second thing I learned from that is, just raising your hand and taking on the hard problems because I think you learn more. I think it's easy, right? I never was in big law. I know a lot of folks that, went through big law and had, some great experiences. I also know folks who, spend a lot of their years in big law doing kind of the rote mechanics of law, right? Learning, you get precision, but you don't necessarily learn to balance risk. You don't learn how to find these corner cases and actually figure out what's going to happen in a corner case. So when you take on those really hard problems, you quickly figure out how they're going to, you see how they unravel. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. But I think when you take those hard problems on, then over time you start to figure out what's the likelihood that, these hoof prints are going to be a zebra versus a horse. What's the likelihood, right? That, this one clause in a contract is going to lead to some huge litigation. So yeah, those are the two things I took away.
I love it. Yeah. So for context today, Kaniah is the chief legal officer of a company called Quantinuum, which is doing quantum computing. So maybe for our listeners, I'm semi-familiar, but what is quantum computing?
It's a great question. That is the multi-billion-dollar question in quantum, which is how to explain quantum computing. So I think, a lot of people are, when I first started doing this about 8 years ago, I would use the analogy that people understood quantum under kind of in a three-prong rubric. The first was you might have heard about it because you watched Marvel movies and it's Ant-Man, right? The second is you might have been told by a man in black about this, scary thing called Shor's algorithm, which is going to break public key encryption. And that's going to be the next huge issue to face us, as a society. And then maybe you've learned enough about quantum where if you Google it and you see a really pretty gold chandelier looking thing, you might be able to understand that that's a dilution refrigerator. And I use that context because I think it helps level set that everybody wants to talk about Schrodinger's cat and quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is extraordinarily hard. But what you do need to understand is the principle behind it, which is essentially when these systems scale out to, large scale, what we call large scale fault tolerant systems, being able to solve real world problems, they can solve problems that you can't solve today. A good example that I've heard of many, many examples that folks try to give on how you can solve it and make it relatable. And there's two that I kind of like to use. One is if you think of planning a wedding and you have 100 guests and 10 tables. If you are planning it, it might take you a few weeks to figure out the right seating chart because your brain, the way your brain is thinking about it, you are solving and kind of eliminating possibilities, multiple possibilities at the same time, right? You know that Uncle Joe just can't sit next to Aunt Mary and that the two cousins need to be at this table and this table, whatever. Typical classical computer is not going to be able to solve it. It'll take 10,000 years to solve it because, right, it's working in these ones and zeros, and every probable chance, every iteration of where those people could sit, it has to first figure out and then eliminate it, right? And so a quantum computer is going to function a little bit more like the way your mind thinks. It's going to eliminate a lot of these probabilities at once to get to that, the most ideal, optimal seating arrangement. The other example I've heard people give is if you think about a hotel, 100 rooms, there's treasure in one room. You have to go find that treasure. You knock on every door and open every door. It's going to take you a really long time. If you could find a way to open all doors at once, then you can identify where that treasure is. it's a challenge, right? Because to really get into it and to start explaining that, you have this single qubit that, is sitting between a ground state and, it's I can't remember even what the state of energy is called, right? But, it's kind of sitting in this special state and it's holding all of this information at once. And then you do a measurement of it and you figure out what that, information is. It starts to get a little bit cloudy. So I think you find a lot of people like to use analogies, but the critical piece is what does it mean for us, right? And so that's where we like to give examples like, say, in chemistry. We worked with Microsoft recently and we're able to identify a catalyst and really be able to map out exactly what was going to happen in the chemical reaction as nature provides it. And you would think that we could do that using classical computers, but we can't. We get close, but we can't. You find this in imaging with quantum sensing and being able to like get the exact image. It's like a lot more precision. So that's where we like to focus in terms of what is quantum, because otherwise you'll kind of go down a rabbit hole of how do you get this crazy energy state where something's a 0 and a 1 at the same time, right? So that's
I
where we
love
kind of like
that.
to focus.
I love that. It's so funny because so thinking about the wedding guest complexity, you throw in my mother who randomly is inviting, her hairdresser or whatever. And it's like just the ever changing complexity. That's a perfect example. So funny enough, here on the, we did some show notes before and it said something like, Kaniah is a good translator. So I feel like I understand quantum. So we hit that point. Delving one layer deeper, how did you build that technical fluency over your career to go from sort of early NIST and kind of cyber through to quantum? And I think you did a stop at Honeywell doing complex technology there. What are some tips and tricks that our listeners might try to get to that point to where you are, and what do you
Yeah.
do to build that?
So first, thank you. I'm glad that made sense because as I'm talking, I'm like, I feel like I'm rambling on trying to explain
Yeah.
quantum. I'm always balancing like how much technical do you get versus how do you kind of rely on some of these other areas, or like how do you think about moving towards what it does versus how it operates. But for me, honestly, what I did is again, I kind of relied on the ask a bunch of questions. I found a bunch of scientists. I'm really lucky. I work in a field with we have 350 plus PhD physicists and scientists. So, folks who worked with some of the Nobel Prize winners for ion trapping systems from the team that came out of NIST that won the Nobel Prize on this. So, our teams, I have some of the best and brightest in the world. And what I found is they're very happy to kind of spend time with me if I explain Supreme Court cases to them. So we would sit down like over lunch or over a beer, and they would kind of start with some basic mechanics of physics, right? Thinking about like the transfer of energy and thinking about like how different principles are functioning. And then I would in turn, they'd say, like, help me understand this legal principle, right? And so I'd try and find a way of, I don't know, explaining. First, I'd be like, what cases that I got to prepare? Like, I'm not necessarily reading every Supreme Court case that's coming out, but, certainly some of the big ones that have come out over the years, they're like, help me understand this principle, right? So, um,
Yeah. So like, I guess like day to day, so looking back on yourself, before walking into the Cobell case or when you first went in-house at those moments, you're giving yourself a piece of advice. What do you say?
Oh gosh. Speak up and don't be afraid to ask for things. I think, one of the biggest lessons I learned, and I do try, I hope this isn't a problem anymore, right? I mean, there's so many women these days in the legal field. I remember when I started law school, they said ours was the first class that had an equal number of men and women, and then it kind of dropped down again, and I don't think it came back till 2017. But when I was early in my career, I remember I walked into one of my colleagues' offices and he had two computer screens. And again, at the time, that wasn't really common. And I was like, how did you get two computer screens? I want two computer screens. And he's like, did you ever ask for it? I was like,
Exactly.
no. No,
Exactly.
I didn't. I did not ask. And so that's the advice I would give myself, and that's the advice even today. I'm like, have you asked for what you want, right? If you want a raise, ask for it. If you want, right, you've got to be a little bit aggressive for yourself. And I find, at least for me, I tended to be aggressive for everyone else and then shy about asking for myself.
Yeah, no, it's great advice. So the judge that I work for, there's an expression in Spanish, el no ya lo tienes, right? You already have your no if you don't
Mhm.
ask. So in this
Yeah.
case, the two monitors. I'm also not surprised, techie having two monitors. I personally like the ergonomics of just the one, but when you're reviewing, very high volume of legal work. That's a must. So how I'm gonna go off script a little bit, but tell us about Kaniah, the general counsel, and kind of when you became a general counsel, and then sort of like how are you in that role?
Yeah, thank you. I like to think of myself as a business partner first. When I first walked into the role, I was very lucky to have a mentor who, in Honeywell, he hired me in. He felt very strongly about promoting women and minorities, BIPOC, making sure and not just hiring them in, but also really helping to mentor and grow people. And one of the things he always said to me is like, don't be the office of no. Don't assume, don't take the most conservative position. Figure out how to make the business, do what the business wants to do with it as much as you can. We used to say right but fast, right? Or fast but right. Those kind of principles. But very early on when I started acting as being a GC, I really tried to be that business partner first. It also irritated me that I was a cost center. By the way, of course, right, that is how legal functions. I just didn't appreciate it at the time. I was like, I have value. I'm not just a cost. And so, I would say to myself, how can I show my value? And I found a lot of it was really sitting there with your leadership, right? From the very beginning, figuring out what is it you want to do. You want to go sell something? Let me help you. I'll stand right there with the BD team, right? Ready to sell the products and then write the contract in the manner that's the best for us. But right? I mean, you're kind of structuring the deal from the beginning and you're building relationships with, outside counsel, well, not just outside counsel, but outside parties. And you're really trying to find the best solution for everybody.
Great. No, I love that. So you mentioned adding value. You in particular have found a lot of areas that are very kind of public policy, government adjacent, right? So you started off in interior, now you're working in quantum, which of course is highly regulated. Spent a lot of trips to DC. If you follow Kaniah on LinkedIn, she's a great follow on LinkedIn for many reasons, but you're going to see a lot of capital steps pictures. So, in particular, on the policy side, how have you added that value? And was it something you specifically sought out?
Yes. So right after I started working in the quantum field, when I first started with Honeywell, we Honeywell had not told everybody what we were doing. It was still kind of this secret, small, kind of skunkworks project that was tucked away, reported right to the CEO, which was helpful, right, in terms of kind of scaling out the business. But we hadn't told the street, we hadn't told anybody. So in about late 2018, early 2019, it came to our attention that we were too big not to tell everybody, right? We were finding success. As we were making the announcement that Honeywell was investing in quantum and building a quantum computer, I learned that the US government was looking to impose very strict export controls on quantum. And I think at the time they were suggesting somewhere, I think, roughly 200 qubits. There was no, and by the way, qubits aren't all made the same. They're noisy. They have, uh, they have errors in them. And so having a noisy qubit isn't very helpful. And so what we were trying to get folks to understand is you need to have a qubit that has high fidelity, basically where 99.9+% of the time you're going to get the answer you expect to get, right? You're not going to have this interference. And at the time, the government really wasn't listening. And so what I found was there was such a small group of people who understood the technology and they were all scientists and that meant they didn't really understand public policy. And so I started meeting with the regulators and frankly going up to Capitol Hill and talking to Congress members to try and just get them to understand, if you're a public policy person, you've got to have a little bit of context for the technology, and if you're a scientist, you've got to have some understanding of public policy and economics and what the marketplace, what's happening in the marketplace. And I'll give you an example. The technology relies on a lot of suppliers that are overseas, and many of these suppliers for some of the key parts, whether you're talking about dilution refrigerators or lasers. And we don't use dilution refrigerators. That's used by superconducting systems like IBM. We use lasers. But these makers, these suppliers, they're mom and pop shops. There's only, I believe, two companies in the world that make dilution refrigerators. And that's starting to change a little bit. Folks are, kind of investing
So
now.
dilution refrigerator. So this is literally like you're gonna have an explosion if you don't refrigerate this stuff. Is that is that
Sort
is
of.
that fair?
Kind of, yeah. No, it's a pretty gold chandelier looking thing. Essentially, what it does is it pumps helium-3 down into the chip to remove the heat so that you can actually generate the qubit and perform operations on the qubit. So without getting too technical, that's a superconducting system. They have a chip, and I think it's called a Josephson, essentially where you have like a grid like this. Yes, that's exactly
All
what it
right,
looks
I found one. So it's a golden chandelier grid. All
like.
right, good stuff. Okay.
And it essentially, you run that helium-3 through all of those coils down to the bottom to where that chip is to help cool it so that you can actually create that qubit and read the information off of it. So that's a dilution refrigerator. Lasers, I think more people kind of know what a laser looks like for the most part. But
Yeah.
again, you're talking about these were made for academics. These mom and pop shops would maybe make a handful of these things a year used by researchers and professors. And so in say the laser space, we were talking to these suppliers and they're used to lasers that maybe need to have say a 2000-hour life and we're like, no, we need 10,000 hours. So suddenly you're not just asking for them to create, bigger or more powerful systems. You're actually fundamentally changing their product in addition to yours. And so when that product is sitting in say Finland or Austria or Germany, having export control regimes in place, right, where you have to get a license for R&D, that's a really, really challenging thing, especially for smaller companies. So that's where I spent a lot of time trying to get regulators to understand, got to make this process easy, or else countries that have, domestic capabilities to do this are going to they're overtake the US market because the US companies are not going to be able to get what they need, right? So yeah, so I did spend a lot
Wow.
of
So it's got so basically so the public policy aspect is like you've got kind of a limited supply chain or a traditional supply chain. You've got this super high promising technology that is difficult to understand. And then you've got, a many billion-dollar public company, Honeywell, doing this work. And the question is like sort of similar to circa 2003 Kaniah, where it's like, all right, we got this problem, kind of figure it out, go to the Hill. So walk us through a meeting that you might have on Capitol Hill for this, maybe like from like the prep to the meeting itself.
Yeah, so I will say it helps that I've been doing this for a number of years, and I know today I know how sophisticated each member is or is not in quantum. So I'll
Wow.
say,
Okay. So you map out in Congress, you're like, all right, Senator Markey may
yeah,
not be as familiar, Senator whatever
that's right,
is okay. Got it.
that's right. And there's a tech committee. There's not quantum is growing, but at the time when I was initially talking to folks, it was in 2018. It was when the National Quantum Initiative Act was initially coming into play, and it was really just a hi. This is quantum. It is outside of labs. It is a real thing. This is companies are investing. Big companies like Honeywell and IBM and Google and AWS, right? They're all investing. Today, the conversation is much more nuanced, where it's you really need to be investing in these particular use cases because that's going to be, and making sure the funding is very strategic so that it can help, grow and develop the ecosystem, but also help promote certain use cases that need to be studied earlier on, right? So I think the legislatures have a much better understanding of some of the nuances, right? So the early cases in quantum, we think, are going to be sitting more in chemistry, right? As opposed to say optimization, like the problem I gave you with the wedding scenario. That's really more of an optimization problem, which isn't going to be the initial problems that are solved. It's going to be much more around the chemistry, big pharma. I think we've had a lot of focus from JP Morgan and other financial investors who are very interested in running like Monte Carlo simulations, right? So showing the Hill that, hey, this is a big deal and big companies believe in it enough to invest. It's important. But I think I'd say today what we do is we want to, we have specific asks. So we map out, of course, to the extent there's any funding, we map out the appropriators, both on the House and the Senate. We look at who has made public statements on quantum, who's been supportive of the bills in the past. And it's very interesting. It's very bipartisan. You'll find,
Mm.
right, like Senator Blackburn, huge supporter. Representative Khanna from California, huge supporter. And there's a lot of it's hopefully going to stay bipartisan. It's just that whoever you're talking to kind of has a different interest. So on the Democrat side, it tends to be a little bit more about economic security and kind of growing jobs and things like that, like you would expect. Also around environmental, right, impacts on the or reducing impacts on the environment. Republican side tends to be a little bit more focused on national security, making sure we're keeping up and not allowing, adversary nations to advance beyond in some of the technology. But both of them wind up to be the same, which is how do we help promote the technology? So we spend a lot of time around talking points, but making sure they understand why it's important for their constituents.
So it sounds like some of the time, it's obviously a long game, but you hit your message hits. So I read that the UK made a $500 million quantum commitment. There's new legislation here in the US proposing a quantum sandbox act.
Mhm.
So what next? So you get them to make this commitment. And then how does that affect your job, right? So like your GC now, this quantum company, you brought in this amazing boon being the government action. What do you do? Does it come with handcuffs? What is it? What happens next? And I
Yeah,
know you probably can't talk about it as much, but just really thinking about this end-to-end journey of kind of public policy.
so I think I would say a lot of it is focused on learn quantum in all these aspects, right? And the reason I say that is because right now the US government has invested in a program called Quantum Benchmarking Initiative out of DARPA. And essentially, they're kind of evaluating right now the scalability of a number of different systems. We're participating in it, but so are a number of companies. I think that's a good thing. I think it's good for the government to really test the efficacy, right, and the scalability of various systems. I think the challenge that is facing the quantum world right now is that you have a lot of companies and the government, doesn't want to pick winners and losers. And that's fine, right? We believe in our technology, we believe we're the best, and we believe that we're going to succeed. And so from our perspective, what we really want to see is we don't want to see the US government contract or ignore quantum. And we also don't want to see a situation like back in the 80s where remember genetic testing was kind of first getting started and there were all these scary stories about like monsters running around Harvard Square.
Yeah, yeah.
MIT was like making these crazy things in their labs, and that's just silly, and we don't want to see that kind of regulation. I mean, better than anyone kind of the regulatory quagmire AI is in globally right now. And so for us, I think we feel very strongly about making sure that there's smart regulation that people understand, right? I've heard people say, "Oh, we should just regulate quantum the way we do AI." And I'm like, "No, please."
No, so why does that cause the face palm, Kanaya? Why is that a face palm? Tell me more.
It's a facepalm in part because I think it's like, what problem are you trying to solve? Even with AI, and I take that problem there too, right? What problems are you trying to solve? And does the framework you're proposing actually solve them? So, right, I mean, and if a lot of it is around data privacy, let's look at the data privacy frameworks that exist today, maybe create stronger data privacy, and then like port that over into the technology you're talking about, right? Because otherwise you come up with these really, heavy-handed, blanketed regulatory regimes that create a lot of stress on small startups.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I try to be, moderately neutral, I think, on this stuff, but on AI in particular, the idea that the technology could be used for bad, yeah, of course it can, but so can, fire and electricity and cars and everything else. And so, this is one where I do tend to agree, with Sam Altman or with others that have testified on the Hill that it's like, okay, this technology has this potential, like, let's look at the application layer things. There's things like the revenge porn and sort of like things associated with bad use or financial sick fraud using AI to create a voice double of somebody. Okay, that's fraud. Prosecute that. It'll be interesting to see. Any predictions? What's going to happen with AI regulation?
I don't know. I want to use no, I hope that cooler heads prevail and that we have, again, smart regulation. I don't disagree. It's a powerful tool, but oh my gosh, like you say, right? There's already frameworks in place to address criminal behavior. And so it's just one tool. I mean, we feel that way in quantum. Will quantum break public key encryption someday? I'm sure it will. You can use it, not today, but eventually you can use it to break for cryptography, right? You can break encryption with it. But guess what? You can still hack a system. You can still call somebody up, put in ransomware. There's so many other things that you can do to exfiltrate information and to, kind of act poorly, be a bad actor. So, I hope I hope that as the regulations progress, and I'm sure that they will, that at least they will take into consideration the impact on small companies and small startups and not create regimes that are just, really kill the small company in favor of the large companies. That's what I really, really don't want to see.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the sort of like there was a really Bill Gurley gave a big talk. We'll drop in the show notes around kind of like regulatory capture, and it was interesting for me to see a big name VC really get into the issues that I've been thinking about around public policy and how you regulate and looking out for customers and kind of what is the optimal thing. It's been fascinating, of course, with the new administration and so on. Again, I'm not gonna get political. But I definitely it's something that as lawyers, and I think I had the same thoughts you did when you got on Cobell of like, okay, which side am I on? But then I think about like when I was at Amazon and I advised a company on accessibility, I did so much more for accessibility of those devices than I ever could have as an advocate or as a government regulator, because there were a bunch of times where if it was easy to do the right thing and if it was something where we could have good wins on accessibility, I would do it. So, or, encourage the company to do it. And it was great. And I think ultimately, like, thinking about the opportunity of tech, I even see it here at GCAI, right? People like you or GCs like you are using it, every day to be more strategic, to prep for those meetings, to get things done. So yeah, it's been really fun. All right, let's go to the lightning round. So basically, it's been super fun. I've been educated on quantum, and harken back to my wedding some years ago with my mom inviting hairdressers and throwing them at table seven with Uncle Marty kind of thing. But anyways, here we are. So what's a book or concept that has shaped your thinking, something that has influenced you?
So probably not relatable for most people, but the number one book that kind of shaped me was Killers of the Flower Moon. And when I read it, I was like in my 30s, and I remember I was sitting in my apartment reading, and suddenly I see this passage that talks about Charlie Whitehorn, who's shot, basically murdered. And I sat back and I was like, my dad's name is Kenneth Charles Whitehorn. So I pick up the phone. I'm like, Dad, I'm reading this book about, and so premise of the book, I will watch the movie if you haven't. It's a great movie. Essentially what happened is a lot of white settlers moved into the Osage Nation. The Osages had been in Missouri. They moved to Oklahoma in part because they felt like no one would want that land. It was pretty crappy land. Just so happens they preserved their mineral rights and there was a ton of oil where they were settled. They suddenly, in about the late 1800s, early 1900s, became the wealthiest people in the world. They would be akin to kind of what the Middle East, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris are today. So reading this book, I come to find out this is impactful to my own family. And it started this journey of kind of digging back into who am I? Where do I come from? What happened with my family? And kind of because I love to look in the future. I love tech. I love like what's happening next. And it was the first time where I took a step back and said, where do I come from? And what does it mean? And how is it impactful to me and, my family, my people, my tribe, et cetera?
I did not expect that answer. That's lovely. So good. Any bold prediction about the legal field? Stepping us into the future. We're talking in 5 years. Maybe we're not on a podcast. We're exchanging chips in our brain or something. But what do you see 5 years from now? How's legal practice?
So I swear to you, I am not saying this because of you and GCAI, but I believe every lawyer is going to be using, hopefully GCAI, but some AI tool. Think, I cannot tell you how much it has revolutionized my law department, my team, I've contracted hiring. I have streamlined how we use our outside counsel. And I think that more and more law departments are going to start using these tools. I think today you still have a lot of fear and uncertainty, and people just don't appreciate some of this concern about how is it trained and what is, where's the confidential information come from. But 100%, whether it's GCI or some other tool, hopefully GCAI, of course, but
So kind
AI
of you.
is going to be all over the law department.
I love it. I love to hear that. All right. So you've given us so much to reflect on, from kind of quantum to working in government to, kind of the personal side. Incredible courage to run into complex things and have this amazing career. Anything else that you want to leave listeners with?
Gosh, all I can say is I just really appreciate being here. I think when I first met you, I was so impressed. I love lawyers, or well, because of course you're a lawyer, but you're also a CEO, and I love to meet visionaries who can actually take their vision and execute on it. Right? I don't. I shouldn't say there's not a ton of visionaries in the legal field. I shouldn't say that, but you know,
You're just like making it happen. No, I mean, you've done that. I mean, literally, you've taken this technology, quantum, which is like, it literally is like physics. And by the way, Kanai majored in physics, which is like
No,
kind of
no,
amazing.
no. I actually double majored in international relations and Spanish to avoid physics. That's the irony of my life. I chose William and Mary. I did this double major because I figured out if I did that, I wouldn't have to take like calculus and physics.
Wow, look at that. Well, it works out. So congratulations, Kanaya. It's so exciting. Thank you for joining us. This has been so much fun. That was my conversation with Kaniah Konkoly-Thege, a legal and technical translator with a gift for making sense of the very hardest problems. If you're working at the intersection of law and emerging tech, or just trying to think more expansively about your career and leadership, I hope this episode gave you something useful. Follow CZ and Friends wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to our newsletter at gc.ai/newsletter, or just find us online. You can find me on LinkedIn. We'll give you behind the scenes insights, guest announcements, and practical tools for legal and business leaders. Thanks for listening.